You're standing in a graveyard at midnight, which is either the beginning of a great adventure or a terrible decision, and tonight you're here to understand why the most powerful magical object in the Harry Potter universe has a body count that would make a horror movie villain jealous. The Elder Wand, that deceptively simple stick of elder wood with a core of thestral tail hair, has passed through more hands than a cursed game of hot potato, and nearly every one of those hands ended up cold and dead. Which really makes you wonder about the appeal of ultimate power when the retirement plan is invariably murder. This isn't just a story about a wand, though. Calling it just a wand is like calling the atomic bomb just a firecracker. This is a tale about human nature, about the fatal attraction to power, and about how a bedtime story told to wizard children became a self-fulfilling prophecy that shaped magical history for over 1,000 years. You settle in, pull your invisible blanket of curiosity a little tighter, and prepare to trace the blood-stained path of an object that was supposedly created by Death himself, though we'll get to the question of Death's craftsmanship skills in a moment. The thing about the Elder Wand is that it never seems to work out well for anyone, which you'd think would be a deterrent, but apparently unbeatable power is a marketing pitch that never gets old, even when the fine print clearly states that previous owners have experienced side effects including paranoia, betrayal, and fatal stabbing. In the real world, we have a fascinating historical parallel in the Hope Diamond, that stunning 45.52-carat blue gem that supposedly brought misfortune to its owners, from Marie Antoinette, who lost her head literally, to various other aristocrats who met untimely ends. Though modern gemologists will tell you that correlation doesn't equal causation, and most of those people were rich during revolutions, which is historically a high-risk demographic regardless of jewelry. The scholarly debate about whether the Elder Wand ever actually existed outside of Beetle the Bard's fairy tale is one that makes academic conferences wonderfully spicy, with some magical historians insisting they've traced its lineage through documented duels and murders, while others argue that multiple powerful wands existed and the Elder Wand became a legendary brand name that various wands got credited with being, sort of like how every old violin gets called a Stradivarius at estate sales. But here's where it gets interesting, and you lean forward because this is the part where fiction and reality start doing a complicated dance. Whether or not the wand existed, the belief in it certainly did, and belief in the wizarding world has a funny way of making things real, or at least making people act in ways that create real consequences. You can trace the wand's supposed history like following a trail of bodies through European history, each new owner typically acquiring it by murdering or defeating the previous one, which is a transfer of ownership policy that makes you grateful for modern retail experiences where you just swipe a card. The wand was said to be unbeatable in a duel, which creates an interesting logical problem, because if you defeat the person holding the unbeatable wand, doesn't that make the wand, by definition, beatable? This is the kind of paradox that keeps wizard philosophers up at night, possibly while clutching their own considerably less legendary wands. Legend says that 3 brothers encountered death on a lonely road, which sounds like the beginning of either a fairy tale or a medieval public health crisis. And death, apparently feeling generous or perhaps just amused, offered each brother a gift. The oldest brother, displaying the kind of ambition that every parent warns their children about, asked for a wand more powerful than any other, and Death, who apparently had woodworking skills in addition to his day job of collecting souls, broke a branch from an elder tree and fashioned the Elder Wand right there, which raises questions about Death's workshop situation and whether he carries wand-making tools on his person at all times. The quirky historical detail that elderwood was actually considered very unlucky in many European folklore traditions makes the choice of material deliciously ironic. Elder trees were associated with witches and dark magic, and there was a widespread belief that you shouldn't burn elder wood in your fireplace or bad luck would enter your home, so making the most powerful wand from the unluckiest wood is either brilliant irony or death's idea of a cosmic joke. Now, you're probably wondering, as you should, whether this is all just a story. And the answer is yes, it's a story within a story, which is one of the cleverest things about J.K. Rowling's world building. She created a fictional fairy tale within her fictional world, giving the Elder Wand the weight of mythology even within its own universe. The idea of Deathly Hallows, three objects that together supposedly make one master of death, has parallels in real-world mythology, from the Greek fates who controlled life's thread to various cultural tales of objects that grant power over mortality, which suggests that humans have been anxious about death and trying to cheat it for as long as we've been able to tell stories. What makes the Elder Wand particularly tragic is that it grants power but not wisdom, victory but not peace. And every wizard who sought it thinking they'd be the exception to the rule of murdered owners turned out to be just another data point in a very consistent pattern. You watch in your mind's eye as the first brother in Beetle's tale uses his new wand to duel and kill a wizard he'd long held a grudge against, then brags about his unbeatable wand, which is tactically about as smart as winning the lottery and immediately posting your bank details online. That night, another wizard steals the wand and slits the first brother's throat because apparently in wizard society, unbeatable in a duel doesn't protect you from good old-fashioned murder while you sleep, which is a loophole you'd think someone would have mentioned. And thus begins a pattern that will repeat for centuries. Acquire wand through violence, brag about wand, or at least let its reputation spread. Get murdered for wand. And the cycle continues like an extremely dark game of musical chairs, where the music is screaming and everyone loses. You're now tracking the wand's journey through the murky centuries between fairy tale and recorded history, which is a bit like trying to follow footprints through a swamp while wearing a blindfold. But magical historians have never let a little thing like absolutely no solid evidence stop them from having passionate arguments. The problem with tracing the Elder Wand's ownership is that its masters tended to die violently and unexpectedly, which doesn't leave much time for keeping detailed records or updating their magical LinkedIn profiles with current position, Elder Wand Master, deceased. What you have instead is a patchwork of legends, rumors, boasts, and the occasional deathbed confession, which is not exactly the kind of documentation that would hold up in a magical court of law, assuming such courts care about provenance when dealing with potentially mythical superweapons. In real-world history, we have a comparable situation with relics like the Holy Grail or the Spear of Destiny, objects whose legendary status far exceeds any historical evidence of their existence. Yet people spent lifetimes and fortunes searching for them, which tells you something profound about human nature's relationship with powerful myths. The scholarly debate about whether the wand's power was real or simply the result of confirmation bias is one that divides magical historians into camps that occasionally refuse to speak to each other at academic conferences, with one side arguing that the wand's thestral hair core gave it genuine, unprecedented power, while the other side suggests that when you believe you're holding an unbeatable wand, you might fight with more confidence and therefore win more often, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that's more psychology than magic. You follow the whispers and legends through medieval Europe, where the wand supposedly passed through the hands of various dark wizards whose names have been lost to time, or perhaps deliberately forgotten, because once you've been murdered for a stick, your legacy tends to get a bit overshadowed by the dramatic irony of your demise. One of the quirky historical details that makes this period fascinating is that medieval wizards apparently had a significantly different relationship with death than modern ones. Partly because everyone's relationship with death was different when the average person might die from a bad tooth or drinking water from the wrong well. So the idea of killing someone for a wand probably seemed less shocking in a time when people died from much stupider reasons on a daily basis. The wand's reputation grew with each transfer of ownership, each duel, each murder in the night, until seeking the Elder Wand became a sort of dark wizard career goal, the ultimate achievement for those who had already exhausted the possibilities of regular villainy and needed a new challenge. But here's what's darkly funny about the whole thing. The wand didn't make anyone master of death, it just made them a target, which is perhaps the most ironic gift death could have given. A tool that promises power over death, but actually just accelerates your appointment with death himself, who presumably has been laughing about this for centuries. You can imagine death as a kind of cosmic prankster, sitting back and watching wizards murder each other over his little wooden joke, each one thinking they'll be different. They'll be the one to keep it, they'll be the one to finally achieve mastery, and each one ending up as surprised as the last, when they wake up to a wand pointed at their face or a knife at their throat. Around the 13th century, if the fragmentary records can be trusted, and there's significant scholarly disagreement about whether they can be, the wand supposedly came into the possession of Emmerich the Evil, which is a name that really doesn't leave much room for ambiguity about his character or parenting style. Emmerich was said to be a short-lived but terrifyingly powerful dark wizard who terrorized the southern coast of England, which in the 1200s was already having a tough time with things like inadequate plumbing and the constant threat of invasion, so adding a dark wizard with a super wand to the mix really didn't help the region's tourism prospects. The historical fact worth noting here is that the 13th century was actually a period of significant magical development in Europe, with the founding of several important wizarding institutions and the codification of various magical laws, so Emmerich's reign of terror was happening against a backdrop of magical society trying to become more civilized, which he clearly didn't get the memo about yet. Emmerich's ownership of the wand lasted only a short time, which is a recurring theme you'll notice, before he was defeated and killed by Egbert the Egregious, which sounds like a children's book character, but was apparently a real wizard with real murderous intent and a real appreciation for alliteration. Egbert's own ownership was similarly brief, creating a pattern that would continue for centuries. Acquire wand, enjoy fleeting moment of power, get murdered, repeat. The fact that nobody seemed to learn from this pattern is either a testament to the allure of power or evidence that dark wizards as a group might not be the best at learning from historical precedent, which tracks with their general decision-making skills. You wonder, as any reasonable person would, why anyone would want the wand after seeing what happened to literally everyone who owned it. And the answer seems to be the same reason people buy lottery tickets despite terrible odds. They think they'll be the exception. They think they're smarter or more careful or somehow special enough to break the pattern. This cognitive bias, where people consistently overestimate their own abilities and underestimate risks, is well documented in Muggle psychology and apparently applies just as strongly to wizards, because intelligence and magical power don't make you immune to thinking you're the protagonist of reality. Through the medieval period and into the Renaissance, the wand changed hands through what you might charitably call aggressive networking, with each new owner typically having defeated the previous one in increasingly creative ways, because apparently just dueling gets boring when you've done it enough times. Some owners lasted years, others merely days, but none lasted forever, and none died of old age peacefully in their beds surrounded by loving family members who definitely weren't eyeing the wand on the nightstand and doing mental calculations about inheritance. The wand became a sort of ghost story that wizards told, a warning about the dangers of ambition, and simultaneously a goal for those who thought warnings were for other people, less exceptional people. People who weren't destined for greatness like they clearly were. You're now entering the period where the Elder Wand's history becomes slightly more documented and significantly more depressing, as you trace its path through the late medieval period when record-keeping improved, but human nature stubbornly refused to do the same. The wand passed through various hands across Europe, leaving a trail that magical historians have attempted to reconstruct, like a particularly morbid connect-the-dots puzzle, where each dot is a corpse. One of the more thoroughly documented owners was Godelo, a dark wizard who lived in the early medieval period and who, in a detail that tells you everything about his priorities, wrote a book called Magic Most Evil while in possession of the wand. Because apparently when you have unlimited magical power, your first thought is, I should definitely write this down for future generations of aspiring dark wizards, which is either admirably scholarly or deeply irresponsible, depending on your perspective. The quirky detail about Godlo is that he referred to the wand as my most wicked and subtle friend, which anthropomorphizes a piece of wood in a way that's both creepy and sad, suggesting he maybe didn't have many actual friends, which tracks for someone whose hobby was evil magic, and whose book title used moste instead of most, because apparently being evil doesn't excuse poor spelling choices. Godlo's fate, in keeping with the wand's tradition of betrayal, was to be locked in his own cellar and left to die by his own son Hereward, who then took the wand for himself, which really makes you think about the state of wizard family counseling services and whether there might have been some earlier interventions available before things escalated to patricide. The historical fact worth knowing is that the medieval period was actually when the concept of wand lore really developed as a sophisticated field of study, with wand makers beginning to understand the properties of different woods and cores, so Godlo's writings, while evil, were also contributing to a broader magical understanding of how wands worked, proving that even terrible people can inadvertently advance knowledge, though that's probably not the legacy he was hoping for. Hereward's ownership of the wand didn't last much longer than his father's, because the universe has a sense of justice even if it's the darkly ironic kind, and he was eventually defeated by another wizard whose name has been lost to history, which is perhaps fitting because if you're going to murder someone for a wand, the least you deserve is historical anonymity. The scholarly debate about this period centers on whether the wand actually enhanced these wizards' powers, or whether they were already powerful and the wand simply gave them confidence, and the evidence is frustratingly unclear because it's hard to conduct control studies when your test subjects keep murdering each other. You track the wand forward through the centuries, watching it surface in historical records like a shark fin appearing briefly before someone drowns. Each appearance marked by a defeat, a death, a transfer of power that never seemed to bring anyone anything resembling happiness. In the 18th century, the wand came into the possession of Loxias, who held it longer than most and earned the nickname the Puckish for his cruel sense of humor, which apparently included using the most powerful wand in existence to play elaborate magical pranks that were probably more terrifying than funny, because when you have that much power, your jokes tend to have higher stakes than whoopee cushions. Loxias's nickname raises an interesting point about how we remember historical figures. He's the Puckish, rather than the murderer or the guy who stole a super wand, which suggests that if you're going to be a dark wizard, having a decent PR spin on your cruelty helps your historical reputation, though it didn't help him avoid eventually being murdered in his sleep by Barnabas Deverell, who clearly didn't appreciate the pranks. Barnabas Deverell called himself the Warlike, which is one of those self-given nicknames that really tells you about someone's self-image and priorities, and he used the Elder Wand to become a feared and powerful wizard, right up until he was killed by Loxias's son, who wanted revenge for his father, creating a pattern of revenge and counter-revenge that suggests the wand didn't just bring power, but also came with a complimentary subscription to multi-generational blood feuds. The detail that makes you shake your head is that during all of this, during centuries of murders and betrayals and dark wizards using the wand for increasingly terrible purposes, apparently not one person thought, maybe I should just break this thing, which is either because they believed the wand was indestructible or because human nature finds it nearly impossible to destroy power even when that power is clearly cursed. In the real world, you have parallels in objects like the cursed jewels of the Romanov family, looted during the Russian Revolution and believed by some to carry the curse of the murdered royal family, though of course the real curse was simply being valuable objects during a violent revolution, which is more historical materialism than actual magic. The wand's path through the 18th and into the 19th century becomes somewhat clearer in the historical record, partly because record-keeping improved, and partly because by this point the wand's reputation was such that its appearances were noted by magical historians who were starting to take a professional interest in tracking legendary artifacts, even if they were wisely doing so from a safe distance. Each new owner would briefly flourish, achieve some dark wizard goals, inspire fear and respect, and then inevitably end up on the wrong end of a wand duel or a midnight attack, their confidence in their own exceptionalism proving to be entirely misplaced, which would be funny if it weren't so consistently fatal. You're approaching the 20th century now, when the Elder Wand story intersects with one of the most terrible chapters in magical history, and you can feel the temperature drop as you move toward the rise of Gellert Grindelwald, a wizard whose ambition would reshape the wizarding world, and whose quest for power led him straight to the Elder Wand like a moth to a particularly dangerous flame. But before we get to Grindelwald, you need to meet Michael Grigorovich, a wand maker who owned the Elder Wand and who represents an interesting deviation from the pattern because he actually acquired the wand through his work rather than through murder, which made him probably the most innocent owner in the wand's bloody history, though innocent is relative when you're in possession of an object that's basically a murder magnet. Grigorovich was a skilled Bulgarian wand maker, one of the most respected in Europe, and the quirky detail about him is that he actually used the Elder Wand to improve his wand-making skills, studying its construction and trying to replicate its power in his own wands, which is like having the Mona Lisa and using it to practice your painting technique. Ambitious, slightly sacrilegious, and probably the most productive use of the Elder Wand in its entire existence. The historical fact worth noting is that the early 20th century was a period of significant innovation in wand lore, with wand makers across Europe experimenting with new core materials and construction techniques, so Grigorovich's work with the Elder Wand was part of a broader professional movement, though his colleagues probably didn't have to worry about their research materials being stolen by future Dark Lords. Grigorovich's ownership came to an abrupt end in approximately 1899, when a young thief broke into his workshop, and this is where you meet Gellert Grindelwald. Though at this point, he was just a brilliant, ambitious teenager, rather than the dark wizard who would terrorize Europe for decades, proving that everyone starts somewhere, and sometimes that somewhere is breaking and entering. Grindelwald didn't kill Grigorovich, which breaks the pattern and creates an interesting question about ownership transfer that magical scholars still debate. Does defeating someone and stealing their wand count as mastering it, or does the wand only transfer allegiance through mortal combat? This question isn't just academic nitpicking, though it's definitely that too. It goes to the heart of how magical ownership works and whether the wand chooses based on power, intention, or some combination of factors that nobody fully understands. Grindelwald stunned Grigorovich and flew out the window with the wand, which is one of the more cinematic thefts in magical history and also raises questions about whether Grindelwald already knew what he had or just thought, "That looks like a nice wand," and lucked into stealing the most powerful wand in existence, which would be the kind of cosmic coincidence that makes you believe in destiny or at least in very good luck. What you're watching now is the transformation of the Elder Wand from a dark wizard trophy that changed hands every few years into a tool of systematic oppression and terror. Because Grindelwald had bigger plans than just being another powerful wizard who got murdered in a few years. Grindelwald held the wand for decades, which is longer than almost any previous owner, and he used it not just for personal power but to build a movement, to wage war, to try to fundamentally reshape the relationship between wizards and muggles under the banner of "for the greater good," which is one of those phrases that sounds noble until you realize it's been used to justify basically every terrible thing humans have ever done to each other. The scholarly debate about Grindelwald's ownership centers on whether his extended possession of the wand proves he truly mastered it, or whether he simply was never defeated in direct combat until his final duel, which is a subtle but important distinction. During his reign of terror, which lasted from roughly the 1920s to 1945 and coincided almost exactly with the rise of fascism in the Muggle world, Grindelwald used the Elder Wand to become nearly unstoppable, defeating opponents, building an army of followers, and spreading his ideology across Europe in a dark mirror of the Muggle dictatorships that were doing the same thing on the other side of the magical Muggle divide. The parallel to real-world history here is impossible to ignore. Grindelwald's defeat in 1945 aligns with the end of World War II, and while J.K. Rowling has stated this isn't coincidental, it creates a haunting resonance where magical and Muggle atrocities were happening simultaneously, as if darkness in one world couldn't help but echo in the other. Grindelwald's story with the wand ends not with his death, but with his defeat at the hands of Albus Dumbledore in what's described as the greatest duel in magical history, which took place in 1945 and which saw Dumbledore, Grindelwald's former friend and possible lover, finally stop the Dark Wizard's reign of terror. This duel is significant not just because it ended Grindelwald's power, but because it represents one of the few times the Elder Wand changed hands through direct magical combat between two masters of magic, rather than through midnight murder or theft, giving it a tragic grandeur that fits the complicated relationship between the two duelists. Dumbledore won, took the wand, and Grindelwald went to prison in Nurmengard, the fortress he'd built to hold his own enemies, which is the kind of ironic punishment that suggests the universe occasionally pays attention to narrative symmetry. You're settling into perhaps the most complicated and debated period of the Elder Wand's ownership, and this is where things get philosophically interesting in ways that make magical legal scholars reach for strong tea and stronger headache potions. Because Albus Dumbledore's relationship with the Elder Wand is about as straightforward as his relationship with telling people the whole truth, which is to say not vary. Dumbledore won the wand from Grindelwald in 1945 and kept it for over 50 years, which makes him by far the longest-serving master of the Elder Wand in recorded history. And you have to wonder whether that's because he was truly powerful enough to keep it or because he was smart enough not to brag about it, which suggests that maybe the secret to keeping the Elder Wand isn't magical power, but basic operational security. The quirky detail about Dumbledore's ownership is that he never used the wand's full name, never advertised that he had it, and in fact spent decades teaching at Hogwarts, while the most powerful wand in existence was just sitting in his office desk drawer like a particularly dangerous letter opener, which shows either tremendous restraint or tremendous confidence that nobody would think to look there. I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled, because understanding Dumbledore's relationship with the Elder Wand requires perspectives from different magical traditions and philosophical backgrounds. And maybe someone from your part of the world has insights into why someone would keep an unbeatable wand, but refuse to use it to its full potential. Dumbledore's approach to the wand was essentially the opposite of every previous owner. He didn't seek power, didn't boast about his possession, and seemed to regard the wand with a mixture of respect and wariness, like someone who owns a very effective but very dangerous pet, and is constantly aware that overconfidence leads to missing fingers. The historical fact worth noting is that the period from 1945 to 1997, during which Dumbledore held the wand, was one of relative peace in the wizarding world, at least until Voldemort's rise, which some scholars argue proves the wand responds to its master's intentions. In the hands of someone who sought peace rather than conquest, it brought peace rather than terror. Though correlation doesn't necessarily equal causation, and maybe the world was just due for a break from dark wizards. The scholarly debate about whether Dumbledore truly mastered the Elder Wand or merely held it is one that generates surprisingly heated arguments, with some arguing that true mastery requires actively using the wand's full power, while others contend that restraining such power requires even greater mastery, and both sides have valid points, which is why the debate continues. But here's where Dumbledore's ownership gets really complicated, in ways that would make a lawyer weep and a philosopher pour another drink. Did Dumbledore ever actually own the wand in the traditional sense, or did the wand simply not have another master who defeated him? This question matters because ownership of the Elder Wand isn't like inheriting your grandmother's china. You can't just will it to someone in your estate planning, and you can't loan it to someone for the weekend because the wand's allegiance follows a very specific set of rules that seem to involve defeat in combat, though even that's debated. Dumbledore's plan for the wand, which he revealed through various cryptic statements and posthumous messages because Dumbledore loved nothing more than dispensing wisdom in the most complicated way possible, was apparently to die undefeated so that the wand's power would die with him, which is either brilliant or optimistic to the point of delusion, depending on whether you think a wizard can actually plan the exact circumstances of their own death. The problem with Dumbledore's plan, as Harry Potter would eventually discover, is that it didn't account for all the variables, specifically the variable of Draco Malfoy disarming Dumbledore on the astronomy tower before Severus Snape killed him, which created an ownership transfer that Dumbledore either didn't anticipate or couldn't prevent, and which threw the entire careful plan into chaos in a way that's almost funny if you have a dark sense of humor about catastrophic failures in complex schemes. You watch Dumbledore's relationship with the wand unfold over decades, and what strikes you is how different it was from every other master. He used it, certainly, performed powerful magic with it, but he never seemed to revel in its power or rely on it in the way previous owners had, treating it more like a burden to be managed than a prize to be enjoyed. In the real world, you have parallels in how we handle powerful technologies, nuclear weapons, for instance, where the scientists who built them often became the most vocal advocates for never using them, understanding that creating power and wisely managing power are two very different skills that don't always coexist in the same person. The wand remained with Dumbledore through his tenure as headmaster, through both wars against Voldemort, through countless challenges and threats. And never once did he lose it to an enemy, which is either testament to his skill or his caution, or both. What makes Dumbledore's ownership truly unique in the wand's history is that he's the only recorded master who seemed to actually understand what the wand represented. Not ultimate power, but ultimate temptation, not a tool for conquering death, but a tool that brought death to those who believed they could conquer it. And his decision to try to end its power says more about his character than all his impressive magical achievements combined, though it also reveals his tendency to make complicated plans without always communicating them effectively to the people who needed to know. You're approaching the most ironic twist in the entire history of the Elder Wand, and you'll want to sit down for this one because the universe's sense of humor is about to become apparent in ways that would make Death himself chuckle into his metaphorical sleeve. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the chosen one, the wizard prophesied to defeat the Dark Lord, became the master of the Elder Wand through one of the most anticlimactic, accidental transfers of power in magical history, and the fact that he didn't even know it was happening makes it perfect in a way that planned attempts at mastery could never be. Let's set the scene. You're at Malfoy Manor. Harry and friends have been captured. Things are looking desperate. And in the chaos, Harry manages to physically overpower Draco Malfoy and snatch his wand. Not the Elder Wand, mind you, just Draco's regular Hawthorn wand, in a scuffle that was more about survival than any kind of formal duel or planned combat. The quirky detail that makes this absolutely perfect is that at this moment, neither Harry nor Draco knew that Draco was the master of the Elder Wand, because Draco had disarmed Dumbledore weeks earlier on the Astronomy Tower and never realized he'd won the allegiance of the most powerful wand in existence, which was now sitting in Dumbledore's tomb, completely unaware that its master was a 17-year-old who was having a very bad year, even by teenage wizard standards. So when Harry defeated Draco, not in a dramatic duel, but in essentially a desperate wrestling match, the Elder Wand's allegiance transferred again, and Harry became its master without seeking it, without knowing about it, and definitely without wanting it, which breaks every pattern in the wand's entire history and proves that sometimes the universe has a sense of narrative irony that even the best writers couldn't invent. The historical fact worth mentioning is that in actual medieval laws of succession and property transfer, possession and rightful ownership were often very different things, and you could have elaborate legal situations where three different people claimed ownership of the same object based on different interpretations of law and custom, so the magical world's confusion about who actually owned the Elder Wand at any given moment has real-world parallels in inheritance disputes that tied up courts for generations. The scholarly debate about whether Harry truly became master of the Elder Wand through such an indirect route is one that keeps magical legal theorists employed, with arguments ranging from the wand's allegiance follows defeat in any form of magical combat, to the transfer only counts if there's intention to claim mastery, and the fact that Harry ultimately used the wand successfully suggests the former interpretation is correct, though that doesn't stop people from arguing about it. Meanwhile, Voldemort, in what might be the greatest strategic error of his entire terrible career, assumed that because Snape killed Dumbledore, Snape must be the wand's master, which shows that even brilliant dark wizards can completely misunderstand the rules of magical ownership when they're too focused on murder as the solution to every problem. So, you have this perfect storm of misunderstanding. Voldemort thinks Snape is the master. Snape knows he isn't, but doesn't know who is. Draco has no idea he ever was the master, and Harry doesn't know he's the current master, which is the kind of complicated ignorance that would make a comedy of errors if the stakes weren't so high and the body count so tragic. Voldemort murders Snape trying to win the wand's allegiance, which doesn't work because Snape was never the master, and then faces Harry in the final battle while wielding a wand that literally owes its allegiance to his opponent, which is tactically equivalent to going into battle with a weapon that's actively trying to help the other side, and explains why his spells kept failing at crucial moments. Harry's actual mastery of the wand is proven in the final battle when he disarms Voldemort, and the Elder Wand, recognizing its true master, refuses to kill Harry and rebounds the killing curse back on Voldemort, ending the Dark Lord's reign in a moment that's both anticlimactic and perfect. All that power, all that seeking, all those murders across centuries, and the wand ultimately chooses the wizard who never wanted it over the wizard who wanted it most. The parallel to real-world power dynamics is striking. Throughout history, the people who seek power most desperately are often the least suitable to wield it, while those thrust into power reluctantly sometimes make the best leaders, from George Washington, who wanted to retire to his farm, to various modern leaders who were drafted into service rather than climbing over bodies to get there. After defeating Voldemort, Harry does something that no previous master of the Elder Wand had ever done. He chooses to give it up, to walk away from ultimate power, which makes him either the wisest master the wand ever had, or the only one smart enough to learn from literally everyone else's example. Harry's plan, which is both simpler and more effective than Dumbledore's complicated scheme, is to die a natural death without being defeated, letting the wand's power die with him, and in the meantime, to return it to Dumbledore's tomb where it came from, which shows a level of restraint and understanding about power that most adults never achieve. let alone teenagers who just saved the world and could reasonably be expected to have some ego about it. You're entering the realm of pure scholarly debate now, where magical historians, wand lore experts, and theoretical magicians argue about every aspect of the Elder Wand with a passion usually reserved for sports fans or people discussing the correct way to make tea. And you realize that the wand's physical journey may have ended, but its intellectual journey is far from over. The central question that divides scholars into various camps, some of which won't attend the same conferences anymore, is whether the Elder Wand ever actually possessed greater power than other wands, or whether its reputation created a psychological effect that made its users more confident and therefore more successful, which is the magical equivalent of asking whether the placebo effect counts as real medicine if it genuinely makes people better. One school of thought, the materialist wand lore faction, argues that the wand's core of thestral tail hair, a substance that can only be seen and collected by those who have witnessed death, gave it genuine enhanced properties, particularly in defensive magic and dueling, which would explain its consistent success in combat across centuries. Though this theory requires you to accept that there's something about witnessing death that makes the resulting wand core more powerful, which is either profound or deeply disturbing depending on your perspective. The opposing view, championed by the psychological magic theorists, suggests that the Elder Wand's power was primarily psychological. When you believe you're holding an unbeatable wand, you approach duels with a confidence that affects both your magic and your opponent's psychology, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where belief becomes reality, which is actually consistent with other aspects of magic where intention and belief demonstrably affect outcomes, like the Patronus charm, requiring genuine happy memories to work effectively. The quirky detail that adds fuel to this debate is that multiple people throughout history claim to have possessed the Elder Wand, and some of these claims were clearly false or referred to different powerful wands, which suggests that the legendary status of the unbeatable wand might have attached itself to various powerful wands over the centuries, creating a sort of brand name effect where multiple objects claimed the same legendary identity. The historical fact worth considering is that in the real world, legendary objects like Excalibur or the Ark of the Covenant have had multiple claimants over the centuries, with various swords and boxes claimed to be the real one, which tells us something about how legends work. They're often more powerful as ideas than as physical objects, and the belief in the object can become more significant than the object itself. Another major scholarly debate centers on the question of ownership transfer. Does the wand's allegiance shift based on physical defeat, magical defeat, or intent to defeat? The traditional view holds that any defeat in magical combat transfers ownership, which is supported by Harry's accidental mastery through disarming Draco, but some scholars argue there must be intent to claim the wand specifically. Otherwise, the allegiance would transfer constantly during practice duels or accidents, leading to ownership chaos that would make the wand's history even more confused than it already is. There's also the fascinating question of whether the wand could have multiple masters simultaneously, or whether it could refuse to serve anyone, which gets into theoretical wand lore territory that makes magical physicists excited and everyone else's eyes glaze over. But the implications are significant for understanding how magical objects generally relate to their users. Some scholars have proposed that the Elder Wand's most powerful feature wasn't enhanced magical ability, but rather enhanced magical sensitivity, allowing it to more precisely execute its master's will, which would explain both its successes and the fact that in Harry's hands it didn't feel dramatically more powerful than other wands, just more responsive, like the difference between a good car and a great car that responds instantly to every input. The Deathly Hallows connection adds another layer of complexity to the scholarly debates, because if you accept that the wand was made by Death himself, which most serious scholars don't, preferring the explanation that the Peveril brothers were simply talented wizards who made powerful, magical objects, Then you're dealing with an artifact that operates under potentially different rules than normal magical objects, which opens philosophical questions about whether objects made by personified concepts of death follow the same magical principles as objects made by humans, and you can see why these conferences sometimes require security wizards to prevent dueling between factions. There's also significant debate about what happened to the wand after Harry returned it to Dumbledore's tomb, with some arguing that leaving it with Dumbledore's body means Dumbledore remains its master in death, while others contend that Harry remains the master until his death, and still others suggest that returning it to the tomb somehow releases it from the cycle of ownership entirely, which would be poetic but isn't necessarily supported by how magical objects typically work. The question of whether the wand's power could be replicated, which is what Gregorovitch was attempting during his ownership, has occupied wand makers for centuries and continues to be a topic of research, with modern wand lore experts attempting to understand what makes certain wands more powerful than others, and whether the Elder Wand represents the peak of wand-making achievement or simply the most legendary example of a general principle that other wands could theoretically match. In real-world parallels, you have similar debates about legendary objects in various fields. Is a Stradivarius violin truly superior to modern instruments? Or is it the legacy and belief that makes musicians play better with them? Does the Hope Diamond truly carry a curse? Or did its owners simply live in dangerous times? These questions about physical objects versus belief and reputation echo the debates about the Elder Wand in satisfying ways. You're watching as the story winds down now, the energy slowly fading like the last light leaving the sky after sunset, and you find yourself thinking about everything the Elder Wand represents in its long, blood-soaked journey through history. The wand sleeps now in Dumbledore's tomb on the grounds of Hogwarts, returned there by a teenager who understood what centuries of powerful wizards could not, that some prizes aren't worth winning, some power isn't worth having, and that walking away from ultimate magical might be the most powerful choice of all. Harry's decision to let the wand's power die with him, to live an ordinary life and die an ordinary death without being defeated in magical combat, represents a victory over the wand's curse that's more impressive than any duel or conquest could ever be, because it required defeating not an external enemy, but the internal temptation that had destroyed every other master throughout history. You imagine the wand lying there in the darkness of the tomb, no longer calling to ambitious wizards, no longer driving men to murder and betrayal, just a piece of elderwood with a thestral hair core, powerful perhaps, but finally at rest after 1,000 years of blood. The story of the Elder Wand is really the story of human nature's relationship with power, about how the promise of strength and victory can blind people to the cost, about how every generation thinks it will be different until it learns the same lesson in the same painful way, and about how the only winning move is sometimes refusing to play the game at all. In the quiet of Dumbledore's tomb, you think about all the masters who came before. Antioch Peveril, who boasted and died, Emmerich and Egbert and Godelo, who murdered and were murdered in turn, Grindelwald, who nearly conquered Europe, Dumbledore, who tried to end the cycle, and Harry, who actually did by simply choosing to walk away. The wand's story has ended, probably, unless someday someone decides that they're smarter than everyone who came before and breaks into the tomb seeking ultimate power. But for now there's peace, and the wand that could not be beaten has finally been defeated by the simple refusal to use it. You feel yourself drifting now, the story settling into your mind like snow falling on a quiet landscape, each detail finding its place in the larger pattern of tragedy and irony and eventual wisdom. The Elder Wand's journey from Death's Gift to Harry's renunciation is complete, a circle that took 1,000 years to close. And in that closing, there's something profoundly satisfying, the way all good stories end with lessons learned and peace restored. Sleep comes easier knowing that some curses can be broken, some cycles ended, and that power over death matters less than how you choose to live. And as you drift off, you carry with you the image of a tomb on the grounds of a castle, moonlight on white marble, and beneath it a wand that has finally stopped killing, dreaming whatever dreams ancient magical objects dream when their work is done and their purpose fulfilled, waiting in darkness that is finally peaceful, finally still.